Imagine a map. A country, etched onto the heart of West Africa, suddenly vanishing, its borders dissolved, its people scattered among neighboring lands. This isn't a fantasy tale. It's the real story of Upper Volta, a French colony that was wiped off the map in 1932, only to be resurrected 15 years later. But why did France erase an entire territory, and what powerful force compelled them to bring it back? The story begins in 1919. France, consolidating its vast West African empire, carved out a new territory from parts of what were then Upper Senegal and Niger. They named it Colonie de la Haute Volta, or the Colony of Upper Volta. This region was home to ancient and powerful kingdoms, most notably the Mossi, whose history stretched back centuries. For the French, Upper Volta served two primary purposes: to provide a massive pool of labor for plantations in the more prosperous coastal colonies like Côte d'Ivoire, and to supply soldiers for the French colonial army. The capital, Ouagadougou, was the seat of the Moro Naba, the emperor of the Mossi, a figure of immense cultural and spiritual significance, whom the French administration had to navigate carefully. For 13 years the colony existed in this state, a reservoir of manpower ruled with an often brutal colonial hand. But the world was about to change, and with it, the fate of Upper Volta. By the early 1930s, the Great Depression had sent shockwaves across the globe. The economic logic that had sustained many colonies began to crumble. In Paris, colonial administrators looked at their balance sheets, and Upper Volta stood out as a glaring problem. It was deemed unprofitable. The colony lacked the rich cocoa and coffee plantations of Côte d'Ivoire or the significant port infrastructure of Senegal. Its primary export was its people, a resource that, while valuable, didn't show up on a ledger in the same way as tons of coffee beans. On September 5, 1932, the decision was made. With the stroke of a pen, France dissolved Upper Volta. The territory was partitioned, carved up like a cake and served to its neighbors. The largest and most populous part, including the Mossi heartlands and Ouagadougou, was absorbed into Côte d'Ivoire. A northern slice went to French Sudan, which is modern-day Mali, and a smaller eastern portion was handed to Niger. For the French administration, this was a simple act of economic and administrative restructuring. It made sense on paper. But for the people living there, it was a cataclysm. Their identity, tied to the land and their traditional structures, was suddenly fractured. Mossi chiefs who had maintained a degree of autonomy under the Upper Volta administration now found themselves under the authority of a new colonial government based in Abidjan, a government that had little understanding or respect for their traditions. The Moro Naba's authority was significantly diminished, and the social fabric of the region was torn apart. This division wasn't just administrative, it had profound human consequences. Young men were now even more aggressively recruited to work on the forced labor projects in the south of Côte d'Ivoire, often in horrific conditions. Families were separated, leaving the former lands of Upper Volta even more impoverished. The sense of collective identity, which had been slowly forming even under colonial rule, was shattered. But it was not forgotten. A quiet resentment began to simmer, a slow-burning fire of defiance that would soon erupt. The initial resistance was subtle, led by the traditional elite. The Moro Naba, despite his reduced power, became a rallying point for discontent. He and other Mossi chiefs began a relentless campaign of petitions and letters sent to the colonial governors in both West Africa and Paris. They argued that the dissolution was a violation of their historical rights and a deep disrespect to their people. They were not just asking for a return to the old borders, they were fighting for the preservation of their culture and dignity. At first, the French administration ignored these pleas. They were just words on paper from leaders they considered subjects. But the pressure was mounting, not just from the chiefs, but from the ground up. The outbreak of World War II dramatically changed the dynamics. France once again turned to its African colonies for soldiers and resources. Men from the former Upper Volta were conscripted in large numbers to fight for a France that had erased their homeland. When these soldiers, known as tirailleurs sénégalais, returned, they were not the same men who had left. They had fought and died for France, had seen the world, and had been exposed to ideas of freedom and self-determination. They came back with a new sense of worth and a diminished awe of colonial power. They had seen France itself occupied and vulnerable. Their return injected a new, more assertive energy into the movement for reinstatement. The quiet petitions of the chiefs were now amplified by the demands of veterans and a growing educated elite. The post-war period was a time of global change. The old colonial empires were beginning to fray at the edges. France, weakened by the war, was forced to make concessions. In 1946, it held a constitutional conference that led to the creation of the French Union, a supposed partnership that granted limited political rights to its colonial subjects. This was the opening the people of the former Upper Volta had been waiting for. They used their new, albeit limited, political platforms to intensify their demands. Strikes and protests, once unthinkable, began to rock the region. The economic logic for dissolution also began to fade. The administrative costs of managing the dispersed territories were higher than anticipated, and the continued unrest was becoming a major headache for the French. Faced with this unwavering pressure from all sides, from the traditional chiefs, the veterans, the emerging political class, and the general populace, the French government finally relented. They feared that the localized discontent could escalate into a wider, more violent anti-colonial rebellion, something they could ill afford while already facing challenges in places like Indochina. On September 4, 1947, almost 15 years to the day after it was dissolved, the colony of Upper Volta was officially re-established with its 1932 borders. It was a monumental victory for the people. They had forced a major colonial power to reverse a decision. This act of reinstatement was more than just redrawing lines on a map. It laid the foundation for the future. Just 13 years later, in 1960, Upper Volta would gain its full independence, eventually renaming itself Burkina Faso in 1984. The story of its dissolution and resurrection is a powerful reminder that borders drawn by distant powers can never truly erase the spirit of a people determined to reclaim their home. It's a chapter of history that demonstrates how collective action and persistent protest can, against all odds, bend the arc of empire. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into a forgotten corner of history. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the past. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. See you in the next video.